So in this section we're going to be looking at therapeutic skills. We're going to be covering the cycle of change, boundaries, we're going to look at confidentiality and engagement. We're also going to explore communication and questioning. We're going to look at resistance reduction, power, empathy versus sympathy, and reflection.
First of all, I want to introduce you to the cycle of change. This is a model that comes from Prochaska and Di Clemente's cycle of change from 1983 and looks at the stages that people go through on their way to making a change. So being a change in their behaviour, changing the way of thinking, something that they want to alter in their lifestyle. So if you look at the different sections, we're going to go through those and look at how there may be relapses or slips in between some of those also, and how each characteristic can be identified towards supporting where people are in that cycle. So pre-contemplation, the first one at the top there, we're looking at somebody who might have no intention of changing their behaviour. So they don't see the behaviour as a problem, they see no need to change. In order to help people get to the next stage, you might want to consider asking them if they think they want to make a change, how they see their future, increase their awareness of what the problem might be, increase their emotional involvement in the problem, and discuss the benefits of change versus the possible benefits of not making changes, but also then looking at the consequences of not making those changes and just sort of exploring that stage of pre-contemplation. If you're finding some sort of barriers there, it's a good place to start with. The next part is contemplation, where someone's aware that a problem exists, but there's no commitment to action. Okay, so they might recognise that there is a problem and they do want to change, but they haven't got to that point of being committed to it. In order to support somebody to move on from that stage and to sort of improve their commitment to want to make change, you could look at the difference that there is between how they are now and how they'd like to be, and looking at trying to instill some hope and confidence in their ability to make those changes. Preparation. Looking at the person's intent on taking action to address the problem. So is the intention there? So they might have decided to change and they might have started to take little steps towards it, starting to test the water. You might want to encourage their commitment to making change, supporting them to develop their own self-efficacy, perhaps trying to motivate them towards that, and generating a plan with them, helping them to set their own goals for action and looking at what those goals might be. Once you've got your goals, and you can start to move towards action, and that is the active modification of behaviour. So in this stage, the person has changed their behaviour, starting to put the plan into action, consciously choosing new behaviours, making new choices. They're enthusiastic, motivated, and they can support progress in that stage by making encouraging statements, highlighting achievements, paying genuine compliments, noticing the differences and the steps that they've started to make. Once you've got that commitment and you've got that motivation, that really dynamic sort of action towards change, you can look at the maintenance of the changes. So making a sustained change and the new behaviour replaces the old behaviour. So the person might have been engaged in that new behaviour for some time. You're looking at sort of a few months that they've been actually sustaining that change and they're committed to making the new behaviour the new way of being. So you need to do less in this stage as the person is managing the change themselves. So it's sort of that watchful waiting and that support and encouragement being maintained, and that person actually developing their own mastery towards keeping that going, and actually they're noticing the benefits of the change as well. Sometimes we will notice that there will be relapse, so we could fall back into old patterns of behaviour. It's sometimes easily done once people start to feel like things are better now, I don't need to carry on doing those things, and sometimes we can slip back into old habits, old behaviours. The person then might feel upset and disappointed in themselves, but actually you can play a key part here in actually noticing that and explaining that it shouldn't be unexpected, that actually these things happen and we often will notice these things, it's quite common, and that you can support with this. So we're not wanting to overreact, not wanting to judge, not wanting to sort of compound that disappointment in themselves, but we can be supportive and help them to sort of see that the situation is again changeable. They did it before, they've done it again. So, you're looking at coming back a stage, so you might look at where we need to go back to. So do we need to go back to action and look at the behaviour modification that they made? Do we need to go back to preparation? Do we need more goals? Relapses happen, slips happen, it is easily done. Everybody can be vulnerable to that. And we're looking at the stages of change being an upward spiral where we can learn from each relapse, and we can look for the signs that things are slipping, what those triggers might be, and look at getting back to that action and maintenance stage and learning from that relapse, whatever might have happened. We can learn from that and carry on in the upward spiral.
So boundaries are really important in terms of therapeutic work. So firstly, we have to think about consent, and you should always seek informed consent from the child or young person with any work around their mental health. Any intervention at all needs to be consent-based. The young person has to want to work with you. They have to be agreed to that. Next thing to consider is self-disclosure. So the focus in therapeutic work, it should always remain on the child or the young person and their need. So part of this is remembering that if you do slip into making any of your own self-disclosures, however beneficial you might feel that is to develop that empathy, that will shift the focus away from the child or young person. So it's really important that that is avoided. Next, we look at expectations. So outlining expectations together from the beginning, that helps build those boundaries and give clarity on what the young person expects to be coming from the intervention. It's really important that they're discussed at the earliest stage and they're in place and clear for both the young person and for yourself. Next, something that's really important to consider is time ends. So those clear timings should be worked out and shared with the young person prior to the work beginning. When we're looking at timings as well, you really need to take into account the age, the stage, the development needs of the young person that you're working with, and the timings being appropriate for that young person. Next, we're looking at objectivity. So as a professional, it's crucial that you remain non-judgmental, and remember that the change should come from the child and young person themselves, and it's not something that we should be imposing on them, imposing our own beliefs, our own expectations on that young person. Really important as well, we need to think about reliability. So if that child or young person is aware that that intervention is going to be taking place, it's on a behaviour that they would like some support around, so therefore it's really likely to be important to them. So they're going to be relying upon you to carry out that intervention that you've outlined to them, and any kind of cancellation, particularly a lack of communication around this, can be really, really problematic. Reliability also is important to consider in terms of how you come across to that young person, and ensuring that you are consistent with your approach, consistent with how you engage with that young person throughout any intervention.
Confidentiality. So when discussing confidentiality with young people and families, it's important to be clear from the start and throughout. So we're looking at this being the first conversation that you have with young people, what you're going to do with their information, who you might share that information with, and what the benefits could be for them. So families like to know who you'll be speaking with, and it also enables you to gather that consent from them as to who you might be able to enlist to provide further support and who might be useful to make sure that they're aware. It also helps young people to have that transparency from the start, to know what you're going to do with their information. A lot of young people are really savvy about this, and they will already know that if they tell you something, they expect that you'll have to do something with that information, and sometimes that's something that's helpful for them. But that said, young people like to have that knowledge that what they do share with you won't be spread around. There are some allowances for privacy, for thoughts and feelings, and how that will be explored during that discussion around confidentiality. You also need to be explaining the exceptions to confidentiality. So where you feel that there may be a risk to that young person or to somebody else, and that you might need to share that information without their consent to do so. So it's making sure that they're aware of that from the start, and that they know that you will explain that and share that with them, and that you'll not go behind the back to tell somebody, and actually you'll explain that to them. What you've told me I'm concerned about, and I'm going to have to share that with this person, as we agreed at the start when we explored confidentiality. So when you're working individually with a young person, you need to ensure you've explored their Gillick competence. Gillick competence is a term originating in England, used in medical law to decide whether a child under the age of 16 is able to consent to his or her own medical treatment without the need for parental permission or knowledge. So the quote that sort of comes directly from that reads, "Whether or not a child is capable of giving the necessary consent will depend on the child's maturity and understanding and the nature of the consent required. The child must be capable of making a reasonable assessment of the advantages and disadvantages of the treatment proposed, so that consent, if given, can be properly and fairly described as true consent." And that comes from the court case that outlines this level of competence to explore. So if confidentiality needs to then be breached, you can discuss this clearly with them, knowing that they have that competence to have understood what would happen should they give information that needs to be shared and it can't be kept confidential. And these are the reasons why. So if you've had that conversation from the outset, you've got that you can check in with. Just to remind you, we did go over confidentiality at the start. Has anything changed with that? And you can make sure that that's a living agreement that is explored throughout your contact with that young person, to make sure that that is really clear and really transparent for them.
Okay, so at this point of the webinar, we're going to ask you to pause the video and turn to page 34 in your workbook. And I just want you to take some time to think about using the mind map, thinking about how you would support a young person to be engaged with you from that very first contact. So thinking about the things that you would do and also the things that you would avoid doing.
Now we need to talk about engagement. An important component which will affect the success of any work that you're doing with a young person is their engagement with the relationship. So you require to have that therapeutic alliance between yourself and the young person. So we're looking at your relationship, and establishing that good working relationship between you and them is core to undertaking any meaningful work. Should always find out from the young person what the problem is in their words. Don't make assumptions that you know what the issue is. Talk about what you'll be doing and set that scene of discussion, and you find that important, what it is in their words, and that you want to know what it is from their perspective. You might know that young person really well, you might have known them for a long time, but actually even in those cases, it's really important that you let them put it into their own words and explore it with you from their own perspective, and gather the picture in that way. So here's some ideas then for thinking about building that engagement. So making sure the environment feels safe for the young person. So we're thinking about, is the room appropriate where you're going to be? We don't want people walking past the door, peering in, distractions. It needs to feel safe. You can't start to work on rebuilding trust and confidence and exploring those personal matters in an environment that doesn't feel safe to share those things. Make sure that you discuss their fears around stigma openly from the start. So making sure that they know that you will be open to whatever they've got to say without judgment, making sure that they know that they can trust you to not repel them, that they can share what they need to share and that you want to help them. And making sure that they know that you perhaps have had adequate training, that you understand the issues that sometimes people face, that you're there to support them, and that's what's going to happen with their information, because trust and confidence is a massive thing with engagement, and not putting themselves at a vulnerable position to that information then be shared with people who they didn't want it to be shared with. So taking steps to ensure that they know that you're taking them seriously. So make sure you've allocated time, that you've allocated that space, that you are there to listen, and that you're really interested to know what's been happening. You know, it can't be that rush chat in a corridor. It needs to be purposeful and, directive, to make sure that they know that you are taking it seriously and that you are finding that important. Showing a genuine interest. So again, making sure that you are invested in the conversation, that you ask questions that are relevant and explorative, that the questions aren't sort of too directive, to make sure that you're not putting assumptions onto what they've been saying, that you're not trying to cut them short. We all can tell when somebody's trying to do that to us in a conversation, and young people can tell that too. So just trying to make sure that genuine interest is expressed, that you're warm and open and engaged with that conversation. And that goes along with using the active listening skills and validation skills. You don't need to fill the silence. Sometimes silence can be a time for them to think and gather what they want to say. And then they can then feel like they have the time and space to share. Nodding, making sounds to show that you are listening to them, reflecting back what you've heard and checking that that's right. Validating, making sure they know that you can tell this is hard for them. It's hard to share and you're doing really well, and thank you for trusting me. And is there anything else that we can talk about here? Is there anything else that would be useful to know? Making sure that you're really trying to encourage that sharing and engagement. Using similar language to the young person rather than the correcting the words they use. So it's really important that comes out from that person's own perspective. If you're sort of changing the wording or sort of adapting what they've said, then sometimes that can skew what's been said. And the same would go for recording conversations as well, making sure that is recorded in their language so that you can reflect back on that and that what they've said, and then you can repeat that back to them, and they know that you've heard that and you've understood that. Remember, it can take time for a relationship to build, so it could take a few conversations for them to trust fully that it's okay to share that with you. So taking that time to build, and when you say that you're going to check in with them next week, check in with them next week. Make sure that when that's been agreed, that's what's happening. Or if it can't happen, having that explanation with them that I can't do it today, but tomorrow we will. Making sure that it's not just sort of left for as and when. My door's always open. A young person won't often take that offer, so it's needing to make sure that you're seeking them out as well to have that planned discussion when you've agreed that they want to have it.
Okay, so a little bit more on communication. Good communication really is vital in a therapeutic relationship, and good communication is predominantly non-verbal. So that includes forms of communication such as eye contact, body language, your facial expression, and the pitch, the pace and the volume. Silences and pauses are a really powerful tool in interventions. So when you're working with a child or a young person, ensuring that your questions are really simple, but crucially allowing that child the time to think and process and then answer. So when you do ask a child or a young person and they might give you a really short response or no answer at all, you find if you leave a silence, maybe using some non-verbal cues such as a nod or an utterance, you may get more information and more details from that young person. They're more likely to fill that silence. And it can be difficult to sit with silence, but it's an important skill to learn and to practice. So next, the therapeutic smile. Smiling is really, really important, and we use the therapeutic smile to really help engage people, showing them that you are genuinely interested, making them recognise that you're calm, you're contained, and just feeling more approachable to that child or that young person. Active listening really complements good communication, and it ensures that your understanding of that child and that young person, what they're saying to you, is very clear. And we're going to cover active listening in a little bit more detail.
Okay, it's a good time now to have a little pause and look at page 35 in your workbook. And that is around good communication, the things that we've been talking about. So go to that page and have a little bit of reflective time about a time when you received some good communication and listening from somebody, when you needed to share something, how they approached it, what they did that helped, and make a note of those things that perhaps helped you to share a bit more, to feel safe and contained, and to know that was going to be a good communication, a good time for you to share that and feel contained yourself.
Okay, so hopefully you've completed that activity, and maybe some of the things that we're going to explore in terms of helping you improve your active listening skills will be some of the things you've recognised you've received from other people. So firstly, making eye contact. It's really important that when you can, and we do understand for some young people, especially people with additional needs, it might be a little bit uncomfortable. So just being very mindful of the young person you're working with. However, in general, making eye contact is really important. It shows that young person that you are engaged, that you are listening and you're present. Next is summarising. So when you are working with a young person, you're able to have that conversation and then feeding back to them, this is what you've told me. This is what I'm taking from what you've said. Asking open-ended questions. When we ask open-ended questions, we allow that young person to really give you a more thorough answer, to really explore with you, and also being mindful of there might be times when that young person gives you a very, very short answer back, but thinking back to what we've discussed previously around the use of pauses and how we respond. So paraphrasing, when you use your own words to then reflect back what that young person has said. So it's very important, there's a difference between paraphrasing and parroting what a young person has said to you. Request clarification. This is really crucial. There will be times when children, young people, they use slang, they use particular phrases. When we don't understand, it's really important that we ask them, can you just help me to understand? What is it that you mean by that? Getting that clarification so you know exactly what that young person is telling you. Ask those probing questions. Really exploring with the young person what life looks like for them, what they're struggling with, how that makes them feel. It's really important that we feel confident and able to ask those probing questions that will help us understand and therefore support that young person thoroughly. And also what's really, really important is being attuned to and reflecting feelings. So it's very easy to say to somebody, are you okay? And they might just respond, yeah, I'm fine, or no. But being able to recognise, you look sad, can I help you? So recognising when you do see that somebody is struggling, when you recognise that young person might be having a difficulty, being able to acknowledge, I can see that you look sad, I can see that you look worried. Would you like to talk about it?
Validation. When we talk about validation, we're looking at the recognition and acceptance of another person's thoughts, feelings, sensations and behaviours as understandable. So you're expressing and communicating to a person that the emotions they're feeling are valid and that they're accepted. The opposite of this emotional invalidation would be that their feelings aren't valid and aren't accepted, which isn't a very safe place to be. So summarising what a person is saying to you, so I can see that you're disappointed. It sounds like you are because you didn't get the mark that you hoped for. Rather than sort of the opposite of that being, hey, no, you did great, that's a brilliant mark. That invalidates that disappointment that they're feeling. As much as the opposite is encouraging, it's actually also, you can do both with recognising that you are still validating those feelings of disappointment as being real and that young person feels that way. So reading or guessing the young person's emotions and naming them. So sometimes somebody doesn't say that they're disappointed, they don't say those words, but you can read that body language and you can read that room and feel that with them and be empathic with that. I'm guessing you feel sad and disappointed that you couldn't go out as planned. I understand that that's disappointing. So making sure that their feelings are validated in that situation, to understand that whilst you're not going to change the outcome, actually it's valid to have those emotions. So then normalising emotional reactions. So of course you're angry. Anybody would feel angry if they felt attacked or wronged in that way. And again, you're not saying that you agree with the behaviours or that the feeling is warranted to the situation. Sometimes it might be disproportionate. But what you are doing is validating the way they feel. Of course you're angry, I understand that. but what we can't do is X, Y, Z, but you still validating what they've felt and how they feel, rather than negating that or rejecting it.
Okay, so questions are a really great resource, a really great tool for gaining that further understanding so that you're able to help that young person provide you with that additional information that you need. So as we've previously said, open questions can really help explore thoughts and feelings. So the 5W questions alongside the how question are really good tools for you to be able to gather this information. So using who, where, why, when and what alongside how.
Okay, the type of questioning that you use is really important as well. So we're looking at mainly open questions if possible, questions that are going to explore their thoughts and feelings, that are going to gather more information and enable them to put it into their words. So asking, do you feel sad, is more likely to get sort of that yes or no, whereas tell me how you feel, you're more likely to get a broader response and to encourage that young person to explore that in their own words. So then following on from there, the different types of questions that you can use to elicit more information, we're looking at clarification questions. So what do you mean by that? You said that you felt this way. Tell me when you felt that way. Tell me when that first happened. Tell me a bit more about that. What do you think is the main issue? And why did you say that? And, you know, sort of putting a little bit more exploration into that. Give me an example. Could you tell me that in a different way? You know, explain that to me. Help me to understand what you mean by that. So those clarification questions are really going to give that chance to dig down and get more meat on the bones of what they're sharing with you. Assumption questions. So we're looking at what is being assumed by what they've said. So what are you assuming by that? What do you think's happening here? You seem to be assuming, is that right? Have I understood that properly? You seem to be thinking that nobody likes you. Is that right? You seem to be thinking that you'll never be able to improve on that. Is that what you're telling me? So sort of checking their assumptions and checking in on those and making sure that you're exploring that. Okay, so then you're looking at viewpoint and perspective. So thinking about what their viewpoint is and what their perspective is on that, and whether there's an alternative way to look at that. So how might somebody else look at that? How might you explore that? If your best friend told you that, what would you say? You know, here's what somebody else has said before. You know, are they thinking about things from a different perspective? And how could you think about things from another alternative? Is there another way of looking at this? Okay, so then looking at the implications and consequence questions. So what would happen if you did do that? How likely is that to happen? Well, what else could you do? You know, how would that affect what happens next? And then what would happen? So looking at sort of exploring the consequences of decisions, exploring the consequences of if things are staying the same. So looking at if that happened, or what else would happen, and then what would happen, and what would be the result of that. So looking at the potential consequences. So, you know, for instance, oh, I'm just going to drop out of school. Okay, so then what would happen? Rather than you telling them, this is what will happen if you do that, you can help them to explore their own implications and their own consequences and come to perhaps different perspectives on that. So then questions about questions. So asking perhaps, why do you think I asked that? You know, why is that question important? Is this question difficult to answer? Why is it difficult to answer? And those questions can then lead to other important issues as well. Why do you think that? Or what do you think about that? So asking further questions. Sometimes young people will want you to tell them the answers, and sometimes it can be really easy to try to do that. But actually helping them to explore the solutions for themselves with these kind of questions can be really powerful to making those changes for them.
Okay, so sometimes we are faced with resistance. We have the young people who might be resistant to work with you. They might be resistant to put into place strategies and recommendations that you've given to them. So we're just going to have a brief look around ways in which we can reduce that resistance. A really key point is avoiding direct arguments. So avoiding getting into conflict with the young person. Also avoiding trying to be the expert. The child, the young person, is the expert around their mental health and around their emotional well-being. You are there to support them and empower them, but they are ultimately the expert. Respect their resistance and listen. Find out what it is they are resistant about. Is it that they don't really understand what they've been asked to do? Is it that they don't agree with the support that's been put in place to them? Really acknowledge that you've recognised that they're resistant and trying to find out how you can support them to feel able to engage. Expressing empathy, always important, and really reflect and reframe the information that you've got to give to that young person if it would be less likely to provoke that resistance. Okay, so sometimes we are faced with resistance. We have the young people who might be resistant to work with you, they might be resistant to put into place strategies and recommendations that you've given to them. So we're just going to have a brief look around ways in which we can reduce that resistance. A really key point is avoiding direct arguments, so avoiding getting into conflict with the young person. Also avoiding trying to be the expert. The child, the young person, is the expert around their mental health and around their emotional well-being. You are there to support them and empower them, but they are ultimately the expert. Respect their resistance and listen. Find out what it is they are resistant about. Is it that they don't really understand what they've been asked to do? Is it that they don't agree with the support that's been put in place to them? Really acknowledge that you've recognised that they're resistant and trying to find out how you can support them to feel able to engage. Expressing empathy, always important, and really reflect and reframe the information that you've got to give to that young person if it would be less likely to provoke that resistance.
So pause the webinar here and have a look at the power activity in your workbook on page 37. So thinking about where power sits in a therapeutic relationship. So thinking about you as the intervention provider versus the young person that you're working with. You might be the teacher, you might be, in terms of the power imbalance, thinking about how that might impact the therapeutic relationship, and use some of your own experiences to help, whether you've got your own experiences of therapy, whether you've had to seek support from a boss, whether the relationship has impacted that, and just sort of thinking where that's sat with that dialogue and how that's impacted what's come out of that.
So in terms of power, it's important to remember that there will ultimately be that power differentiation within a therapeutic relationship, and it's really important to remember that your role within this is a professional one. So for example, we would go to the GP if we had an issue because we believe that they are the expert and they can help us. Within that therapeutic relationship, a child, young person really needs to feel listened to. So that might be really quite different to that typical teacher-student relationship. So in the typical relationship, the role of the teacher is to provide that and tell that young person information. However, within a therapeutic relationship, the aim is to explore the information together. So the power for change always lies with that child and young person. Ultimately, it's really important to remember that you can provide that child, that young person with that knowledge, you can give them those skills, but the power to make that change lies within them. And maintaining that balance can be really hard, but we relate back to it in terms of the boundaries.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
It's important that as your work with a young person is having that therapeutic role, that you always reflect on what you have been talking about, your discussions and your own practice whilst you're undertaking that relationship and that work. It helps to sort of do this regularly. Self-reflection is a really powerful tool. We all come from our own backgrounds. We all have our own sort of genetic disposition, our personality traits. We all have our own experiences, and some of those can be a subconscious bias that we hold and that we need to just reflect on and just make sure we're aware of our own sort of ways of dealing with things, our own perhaps judgments and our own preconceived ideas. So reflecting on those is really vital to do that as a process. But it also helps to understand how you can improve things that you might say that you think, well, I'll not say that next time, that didn't go so well, and also what was helpful and what did work well, so you can sort of always be checking on that. Another thing that we want you to sort of be aware of is whether there's any transference taking place within the session. So we're looking at where somebody that you're working with might redirect their feelings for another person onto an entirely different person. So if we think about it in terms of a child, you know, if they have been raised with quite strict authoritarian family, quite punitive, that they might already have those preconceived ideas about you as that power imbalance is in place, and sort of being aware of that, where they might have put their thoughts or expectations onto you as the therapist, or in another way where they might actually see you as a saviour, see you as somebody that they become reliant on. So just looking for that sort of transference of emotions and that sort of transference of relationships as well, and sort of making sure that you can identify that and name it as well. You know, if you sort of notice that might be happening, you can explore that with your questions. You can explore what's been said. You know, you've said something there that's made me wonder, could you explain a bit more about that? And sort of gathering that information and just identifying it early on, you know, making it clear the expectations of that relationship and making it clear what those boundaries are as well is really important for keeping yourself safe and making sure that perhaps you're not also becoming subject to your own emotional transference. You know, perhaps this young person might remind you of somebody that you know, might remind you of your own child, you know, and just being aware that that transference can flow both ways, and just being really conscious of that. And sometimes you might need to reflect on that or seek further supervision on that for yourself as well.
So as we come to the end of this section in the webinar, we'd like you to again pause the webinar and take some time to complete the activities on pages 39 and 40 in your workbook. So thinking about everything that we've covered so far, what we've discussed, have a little bit of an audit on yourself in terms of which of those skills are you currently using, how frequently are you using them, and what ways could you develop to use them more or to actually introduce within your work with children and young people.